I think we can get started. So thank you everyone for joining today's event. What's next for the Syrian Revolution? Challenges and organizing since Assad's fall. This event is organized by the Tempest Collective, which is a socialist network based in the US. In the face of the crisis we face in the U.S. under Trump and the need for a new fighting left, Tempest is a revolutionary organizing project aiming to be a component of building a revolutionary movement. And this event is being recorded and live streamed over Facebook. On December 8th, the Assad regime collapsed in Syria, and in the nearly 2 months since then, there has been a dual dynamic of both space opening up for popular protests that had been impossible for decades, and also new reactionary policies and control by HTS under Ahmed al-Shara. And today's event will grapple with that kind of dual dynamic and both the feminist mobilizations and popular movement efforts that have been happening for the last 2 months, as well as the reactionary policies, economic and political, that have to be pushed back on. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers, all of whom were recently in Syria. First will be Joseph Daher, who's a Swiss-Syrian socialist and academic and the author of Hezbollah, The Political Economy of Lebanon's Party of God, as well as Syria After the Uprisings, The Political Economy of State Resilience, and the newest book, Palestine and Marxism. Then, if internet permits, will be Sara Ajlyakin, who's in Damascus right now and is a member of the Al-Jumhuriya Collective, which is an independent Syrian media and knowledge production platform. Followed by Omar Hassan, who's a Lebanese-Australian member of Socialist Alternative and an editor of Marxist Left Review, and recently returned from a trip to Syria. And then will be Dr. Banah Ghadbian, who's an assistant professor of comparative women's studies at Spelman College, and recently went to Syria as part of the Syrian women's political movement, and is also part of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. So we'll have each of these speakers for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to discussion. And we know there are debates, and we're excited for the discussion and welcome disagreement and questions, but our community guidelines are that participants refrain from engaging in disruptive or uncomradely and rude behavior, or they will be ejected from the meeting. Without further ado, let's start with Joseph.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you for Tempest for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be alongside friends and comrades to speak about the Syrian refugee process. And I think I'm talking for a bit everyone what was witnessing following the 8th of December, or the 8th of December is a historical moment. I don't think only for Syrians, but for everyone seeking, emancipation and liberation after the fall of a 54 years dictatorship. So I'll try to go back quite fast on these 44 years, coming back to very briefly to Assad father and son, and more to concentrate on the past decade since the beginning of the uprising in Syria within the framework of the revolutionary processes of the Middle East and North Africa that started in Tunis, then Egypt, and spread to the whole region. But briefly speaking, I think it's important to understand that the Assad father, Hafez Assad, established the roots of the authoritarian patrimonial state of Syria with a brief liberal opening, breaking with past radical social policies, but also breaking with a policy of support to the Palestinian liberation and emancipation, attacking the Palestinian liberation movement at different periods of history in the 70s, 80s, and dealing at different occasions with imperialism. definitely his son that succeeded him in power, Bashar Assad, accelerated a lot of characteristics and features we knew in Syria prior to 2000, but more especially regarding economic policies. This was a period in 2000 since 2011 of accelerated neoliberal policies, austerity measures, and transforming the country more and more into a commercial, service-oriented country, obviously with strong features of corruption, crony capitalism. But the key issues that would be at the roots of the Syrian uprising 2011 was definitely the absence of democracy, authoritarianism, the economic development blockade, the impossibility to see a productive development benefiting a majority of the Syrian popular classes, rather political economic policies seeking to favor the interest of a small minority, the 1%, especially businessmen affiliated with the presidential palace, meaning the center of powers within Damascus, especially the political center represented by Bashar al-Assad and his wife Asma al-Assad, military being in the hand of his brother Maher al-Assad. And until 2019, kind of the bank of Syria was considered to be Rami Makhlouf, the cousin of Bashar al-Assad. So the roots were similar to other countries of the region. And I think this is quite important to remind everyone, because very often Syria has been only seen, and unfortunately until today, very much into a geopolitical perspective. What are the positions of various imperialist forces, whether internationally, regionally? But it's important to remind all the comrades here that no, the roots were similar to Egypt, Tunis, absence of democracy, absence of social justice, equality, and basically after various forms of protest movement that were large in the end of the 70s, 80s, a new generation of Syrian looking at what happened in Tunis, and especially Egypt, said we wanted to do the same. We want to overthrow an authoritarian regime that is implementing neoliberal policies that are impoverishing the society largely and creating social inequalities, etc. And therefore, the Syrians, large sections of the Syrian population started to organize through various means. We had the local coordination committees that were local networks trying to organize in neighborhoods, regions, cities around democratic protests, democratic initiatives, democratic slogans in favor of democracy, social justice, equality against sectarianism. Similarly, afterwards, when the regime started to withdraw from particular areas of Syria because they had to concentrate in particular areas to repress, they didn't have the military capacities to control anymore the whole of Syria, we've seen the rise of local councils, meaning people trying to self-organize locally, manage their cities, neighborhood. Without romanticizing, it wasn't perfect, it wasn't the Soviets, let's say, but there were attempts to self-organize democratically, and with various challenges, starting with the regime, bombing often, blocus, siege on cities, but also various military forces from the opposition that were opposed also to democratic ideals and trying to impose new form of authoritarianism. And I think we'll come back to this later. I include in this, obviously, Jabhat al-Nusra that became Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the current president, Ahmed Shareh. The Syrian protest movement was largely peaceful for the first 6 months. Afterwards, people started to defend themselves. First of all, civilian, mostly in neighborhoods. And this is where we had the rise of the Free Syrian Army that didn't have any kind of ideological orientation, clear one. You had very mixed people background, democratic, more, let's say, Islamist oriented. You even have leftists, Arab nationalists, but it was very a big mix without a core unity. Throughout the years, and it's important also to say that at the summer of 2012, nearly half of the country were outside the control of the regime. And this is where we've seen, since the beginning of 2011, beginning of 2012, the increasing intervention of Iran and its core allies, whether Hezbollah in Lebanon or Shia fundamentalist militias from Iraq and other regional countries. But Syria was, so you had large areas that were outside of the control. Without going into in deep, what we can say is that throughout the years, what was a popular uprising, firstly turned mostly, and I know it's a term used in a colloquial language that is not appreciated from large sections of the Syrian, but to speak of a civil war in terms of, in a Marxist perspective, yes, it became de facto a civil war, like any kind of popular uprising, but that was unfortunately more and more suffering various foreign interventions, whether first on the side of the regime, Iran, Hezbollah first, as I told you, and afterwards Russia from 2015 that used its deadly aviation to destroy massively Syrian cities, Syrian civilian democratic infrastructures, etc. And on the other side, there were other countries that still play a negative role. We'll come back to this later on, like Gulf monarchies such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and to a certain extent, Western states as well, that played a very negative role, that don't want to see a successful democratic Syria, because this could obviously appeal to their own populations. So they supported the most reactionary sectors of the Syrian opposition. And throughout the years, despite their disagreements, I would say regional imperialist forces reached form an agreement to see Syria, the chaos controlled within Syria. What do I mean by this? You had, first of all, various forms of countries seeking normalization of the Assad regime, whether Saudi Arabia, Turkey as well, until most recently, US and Russia accepting to find forms of agreement as well in Syria. And throughout these years, we've seen the Syrian regime regaining some territories, whether Aleppo, Eastern Aleppo in 2016, Rif Damascus countryside, Daraa 2019, with reconciliation agreements. And it was mostly perceived that by certain sectors that the Syrian regime won. But how did it win, basically? It was mostly connected to the support brought by its foreign allies. It wasn't able to control the country without the support of Russia and Iran, and the kind of willingness by various regional international regimes to try to re-establish in the region a form of authority and stability. There's various things I could talk also as well, that what will bring to the fall of the regime, the Syrian regime, in the 9th of December is connected to two main issues. First of all, the political economy of the Syrian regime, that after the war deepened its neoliberal policies, deepened the privatization of the state in favor of small networks of businessmen affiliated with the regime, continued austerity measures. This is how we, and ending of subsidies. This is how we reach today. Until today, this is a main consequence of Syrian regime policies. 90% of the population living under the poverty line. It's destructions and massive destructions. Definitely, and I know there's a debate around it, the sanction played a negative role on the population rather than on the Syrian regime. And I always oppose the sanction on the, let's say, the economic sectors of the country where it sanctioned the people rather than core regime figures, military institutions, etc. But what was key was the Syrian regime lost any kind of minimal support. And this is what we've seen on the 8th of December. The soldiers of the Syrian army did not want to fight for a regime they did not like. The regime fell as a house of cards. So the first issue was really on the 8th of December, the fact that the regime didn't have any minimal core support anymore, really. The second main reason is obviously the weakening of its core allies, Russia being weakened by its imperialist war in Ukraine and wasn't able to act as before. And Iran, Hezbollah has been weakened themselves by the Israeli war against Lebanon and its continuous attacks on pro-Iranian targets in Syria. So both actors were not able anymore to save the regime. And this is how what was initially not planned as a military operation to overthrow the regime, what started by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham on end of November, by the taking over Aleppo, reached Damascus in 2 weeks, and without intense military confrontation. So this is how we reached to the end of the regime through this past decade. And since then, and I'll stop here just on my final words, is to say that many challenges are in front of the Syrian population. But as I say, now at least we can speak loudly of these challenges. And obviously, this is already a victory for the Syrian population to speak and to face these challenges. And this is not to undermine the fact that we're facing huge challenges, first by the kind of new government in power, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that is on many aspects not representing a rupture with the Assad regime. If we look at its authoritarianism, forms of also, I would say, sectarian policies, neoliberal politics, and seeking forms of understanding with regional and international actors.
Thank you. Now we're going to have Sara Ajlyakin, if she's able to join. She's in Damascus right now, so she might keep her camera off for better.
Hello, everyone. Yes. Shireen, can you first confirm that you're hearing me, please?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so I'm very sorry, everyone. It's very, very difficult to get an internet connection in Damascus, and so I will not be opening my camera. And even if I do, it's quite dark because we do not have electricity, so you wouldn't have seen my lovely face anyway. So thank you very much for organizing this. It's wonderful to be with such a great set of minds and comrades. I want to start from a baseline here, and thank you, Joseph, for giving the historical overview. And this is a very important baseline for me, specifically when we're speaking amongst comrades and the left and the progressive camp in general, is just being on the right side of history. The Assad regime has fallen, and that is gigantic. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians have been liberated from the dungeons, the brutal dungeons of the Assad regime. And just walking in Damascus, despite 90% of the population living under poverty, and it's palpable on the faces of human beings in this city and in this country, the abject poverty, the lack of infrastructure, the complete abandonment of the state. You can see it on people's faces when you are walking around in the city, that there is a sense of catharsis. There is a sense of a collective sigh that has been released, and not only from the camp that was previously and very vaguely referred to as the so-called opposition, but from the population in its entirety. And even those who previously were aligned with the regime, not as hardcore regime supporters, but rather as just out of fear, or were considered sort of a segment of the population that has not come out and verbally revolted against the regime or took action against the regime. This is the baseline we are working with. I would really like to emphasize that before we go into any discussion about the characterization of HTS and the current caretaker government, because that is quite a formidable baseline. The fact that the majority of Syrian activists, workers, students right now have the space not just to organize, but to actually get to know each other in public, speak in public, think about organizing. When you're walking in Damascus today, you hear publicly from the grocery store and from everywhere you go, from the policemen on the streets, you hear people discussing politics. This is something that we have never done, not only in my generation, and I'm born in 88, but in my parents' generation. My mother is from Hama, where she also saw a genocide in 1982, which, by the way, today we commemorate the anniversary of the Hama genocide for the first time in 54 years. In 54 years, we are able to mourn not only the victims of the Syrian revolution over the past 13 years, but the victims of one of the most brutal regimes in the Arab-speaking world or in the region. And it's very important for us to consider this the baseline, the very baseline before we speak of anything else. Because yes, today Syria is under an incredible amount of challenges, starting with the abject poverty, with the lack of infrastructure, with the stifling sanctions that even if the all kinds of sanctions, of course, individual, sectoral, what have you, that even if we suspend the sanctions tomorrow, the sort of ripple effects that they would have on the country, it would take years, the sort of complete dependence on foreign aid, and we can see this on foreign acknowledgement, of course, and aid, that we can see this already happening with the way that Ahmed Shara, Jolani, whatever you want to refer to him, the way that he is dealing with sort of foreign dignitaries, be they European or Arab or Turkish or what have you. All of this aside, today we are capable of coming, gathering, speaking, returning to our homes, to our families, and not feeling like we have been, and sorry, excuse the word, but that's precisely how Syrians have been treated for the past 13 years, like the scum of the world. We're back to our homes, we're back to our countries, and we can think about organizing. And I just want to share this sense of exhilaration from Damascus and even from all over Syria, because it's extremely overwhelming. And I would never, all of this to go back to Joseph's point, which is we have seen a tendency of colleagues and comrades from the left over the past 13 years look at Syria geopolitically. They have, what is the Syrian government's position vis-a-vis Palestine? What is even HTS position or the current caretaker government's position vis-a-vis Israel? The way I reply to that is that could you have ever thought that the Syrian government, the Syrian regime, or today HTS, is that where we as socialists, as the left, put all our bets on liberating Palestine or the Palestinian people? Absolutely not. Only a walk through Al Yarmouk refugee camp and you'd see the complete destruction that the Syrian Palestinians have suffered alongside the Syrian people. And only through freedom of organization, of affiliation, of thought, democracies can Palestine and Syria be liberated. And this is the starting point that we are talking from today. There are humongous challenges, but one thing that gives me peace, at least right now, is regardless of the HTS's history and their current steps, they have not yet and are incapable of consolidating power in the state the way that the previous regime has. So right now, we have the space, not because it's being conceded to us in a framework of democracy and rights and liberal democracies, but because the space exists de facto amidst this chaos. And in this space, we can organize and we can speak out and we can discuss amongst each other, which is something that did not exist before. And this is our chance today. And this is precisely what every single, I think, Syrian abroad or in Damascus or in Syria is trying to do. Grab the space and consolidate it and talk to each other and speak about organizing and speak about protesting, and it's being done. And so this is my very quick intervention. I'm trying to run because I don't have a lot of time and I can't depend on my net. And again, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. That was so powerful. Hopefully we can come back to you in the Q&A and discussion. Omar Hassan also just returned from Syria and in Australia. Do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, comrades, for having me and for being here to talk about this really important shift that's going on in Syria. And I think the downfall of the Assad regime is one of the most important transformations in Middle Eastern politics for some time. It really reshapes the geopolitical map of the region, shifting the balance of power between Iran and its axis of self-interest and the Gulf states, and also opens up the possibility of renewed Turkish imperial intervention into the Middle East in a stronger way, along with Qatar. And this aspect of the change gets the most attention from commentators and analysts who either see that as a good thing or a bad thing, depending on their perspective. But either way, Syria is just a sort of a stage on which the international players are playing. But I would argue that the Syrian, and that's relevant, but I would argue that the Syrian events need to be understood primarily as an outcome of a heroic democratic and social struggle of a people against their tyrannical government, even if the final act in that struggle was carried out by a force that is not democratic or reflective of the initial goals of the revolution. It's still an outcome of that process. And it's important to understand that the result of the struggle is not determined, despite the immediate situation being a victory for HTS. I really agree with Sara that the fundamental victory here is of the Syrian people, and the struggle for the future of Syria is now underway, whereas under Assad, it was absolutely frozen in dictatorship, in poverty, in misery, and hell for the people there. Now, going to Syria was one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. I'm Lebanese, and I'm used to very extreme poverty. I've been to Lebanon many times, and I have experienced that, but I've never seen a society so scarred and brutalized as what I saw in Syria. And we've all been watching the news from Gaza and seeing the devastation of Gaza. And you know, as leftists, we try and put ourselves in the shoes of the people in that place and see them not as statistics, but as human beings, as families. But it's difficult, you know, but being in Syria and being confronted with a very similar, well, you know, objectively a greater scale of horror, 500,000 people killed, is something else. And many Syrians themselves made that comparison with what Israel has done to the Palestinians. And the scenes from the Ghouta, from Daraya, in the south, from Daraa, and I didn't get to go to Hama and Homs and those areas, but they look very similar. Many on the reformist and Stalinist left have been quite selective in their outrage. They only oppose the violence committed by Israel and the Americans or their allies. And I think as principled international socialists and leftists, we have to see the common thread in all the violence and oppression in the region and globally. That it's a product of capitalism, the preparedness of this minority of parasites to cling on to power by any means. You know, absolutely, they will have no limits to their violence if their power is challenged, and that's something serious we have to confront. And in America, you guys are confronting that in a different way, but I think there's connections there to be made. The scars of this 14-long war of the regime against its people and the 41-year dictatorship before that are still visible on every Syrian. And we can't sort of pretend as if the fall of the government fixes all that. You know, entire cities and regions are in rubble. And the poverty that Sara mentioned is really profound. Something like 90% of Syrians live in poverty, according to recent reports. And there's also the psychological wounds and social wounds of a government that deployed the most extreme sectarianism to try and hold on to power, pitting Syrians against each other, and so on. So this is a society that will take time to heal, and they'll require a lot of effort to try and rebuild on a progressive basis. But I really agree with Sara, and it's impossible not to see the sense of relief and joy after people have been downtrodden for so long. There is a real sense in which they have survived one of the hardest things that is possible to survive, and they've come out the other side victorious. The most common phrase that people said to me was that they feel like they can breathe now, you know, and just that means the right to speak, the right to organize, to discuss the crimes of the past, to their hopes for the future, what kind of system should be established, and so on. I think Lenin called these kind of freedoms the light and air of the socialist movement, the workers' movement. I think it's absolutely correct. There was no possibility of progress under the old the old system. So this is really important to cling on to. As a left, we have to try and step back and have a broader perspective. And I think we've seen from the revolutions and the counter-revolutions in the region over the past 14 years, and also world history, that the fall of a particular regime or figure doesn't necessarily entail a massive improvement in the conditions of workers and students and the poor. It opens up a phase of political and economic struggles, and the outcomes of which are not predetermined. And certainly in Syria, the outcome is not predetermined. So I guess I just want to briefly outline some of the factors and forces involved. So HTS is the main force. I would say it's probably the only nationally organized force today in Syria. That, you know, or at least very much the strongest nationally organized force. At its core is former figures from Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria, which I think, as Joseph indicated, and were one of the most reactionary parts of what you could broadly term the rebels. They put a lot of effort actually into suppressing more progressive rebel forces, consolidating their power in the northern parts of the country. But as time went on, they also integrated other rebels and fighters from all over the country who were displaced from their areas when the regime took control. And so there are some contradictions internally, but clearly the leadership are deeply reactionary. And that's socially, which is fairly obvious. They're a sectarian force. Importantly, they're authoritarian. We've seen signs of that so far with their endless delays of a national convention to determine the process of writing a constitution. They just keep deferring, instead replacing it this week by a secret military gathering, all the figures dressed in fatigues, announcing that Ahmed al-Sharaa is the new president. The media were not allowed to be, present, broadcasting. This was very much an elite affair, and very much efforts to consolidate power behind the new government in a fairly direct and blatant way. Having said that, I agree with Sara that there's still a long way from being able to totally consolidate. So there's no sense in which they're able to, abolish the right to protest or speak or anything like that. We're a long way from that in Syria at this stage. On the international stage, I think HTS have declared their intentions by congratulating Trump on his ascension to power, hoping that he achieves prosperity and success. They have visited Saudi Arabia now as their first interstate visit, indicating a sort of geopolitical alignment. And generally speaking, have a very pragmatic approach to the global system and really just want to fit into the Middle Eastern scene, I think. And with that, they have adopted and espoused extreme pro-capitalist free market policies. On the second day, one of the first things they declared was their interest in a free market economy. Now, in a country with such extreme poverty levels, high unemployment, a huge refugee population, both internally and externally, I think the question of the economic model and policies will go a long way to determining the long-term fate of Syria. At the same time, it's such a big question. It's hard for the left to intervene in its current state. So there's been more protests and organizing around issues like democratic and sort of secular or civil issues than on this scale. But I think this scale will be the most determining in the long run. But so it's unfortunate that the main beneficiary of the fall of the regime so far is HTS. But I think that it's only one side of the equation, even though that is the side that the campus and even the bourgeois commentators in the West want to focus on. There are other forces at play as well. So the Kurdish areas are still very much controlled by the SDF, which is a contradictory force, but sees itself as progressive and is very much at odds with some of the most authoritarian aspects of the regime's rule, of the new regime's rule or plans. The negotiation of that issue, of the Kurdish issue, who've been oppressed in Syria and the whole Middle East really for a very long time, will go a long way to determining what kind of Syria is built, as will be the treatment of the sort of semi-autonomous area of Sweden in the south. Again, where progressive politics is not necessarily highly organized, but is the sort of the norm, as opposed to some of the more Islamist kind of politics that dominate some other parts of the country. And then, of course, there's the active left, which broadly defined includes the workers' movement, civil society groups and networks, and socialist organizations of various types. And it's really, people have to understand the extent of this kind of organizing that's going on. There's gatherings and meetings every day, informal settings, in cafes. I love the situation in Jaramana, where the former officers of the Ba'ath Party have been converted into a social forum, where basically every night there are meetings organized by women's groups, by feminist groups, and other organizations to discuss economic policy, civil policy, the nature of a future state, what kind of constitution, and so on. Like, it's actually wonderful to see. And the activists there are exhausted from going to meetings like every day, multiple meetings. So that is really important. And that is a picture of Syria that you don't get from the media, the mainstream media. There are broad fronts forming around issues like women's rights, the responsibilities of journalists and lawyers. The HTS government is disarming parts of the country, which some people see as a necessary step, though I think that's a dangerous step, but that's how it's widely seen. But then there are civil society groups organizing to make sure that happens in the least offensive, violent, oppressive manner possible. And you know, it's not like they're achieving everything they would like, but they are publicizing some of the outrages and put some pressure on the regime to be more humane in its dealings with the public. And so it's absolutely the task of the left internationally, and of course, most importantly in Syria, to support all of these projects. And that is what they're doing. But then there's also another level in which there's going to be differences of opinion within these fronts. You know, how much to emphasize secularism, how much to emphasize purely political rights versus economic justice, the attitude to the various foreign powers, whether thinking workers deserve rights. You know, there's a sense in which the public service is corrupt and does need to be cleansed. That's quite widely held. I think from a socialist perspective, we should be very hostile to HTS's plans to sack, for example, more than half of the public service. So these are all debates. And so within this project, the need for a left to congeal, a serious socialist left, I think, is also important, and something the comrades there are trying to do. My feeling is that this is going to play out over time, that any attempts to foreclose the situation and to declare anything in any direction is premature. HTS, as Sara said, is not nationally hegemonic by any means. They're trying to build that hegemony, but there are all the counter forces I mentioned, and probably others too. There is some goodwill towards them, I think we have to acknowledge, in the public. There is a lot of wait and see, hopeful attitudes, which I think is less than ideal. It would be better if people approached every government from a position of skepticism, and certainly this one. But I think that is the reality. And so for now, the left and the civil society networks are fighting defensive battles, I think we can say. But hopefully in the future, there's more space to go on the front foot. And I think, to be honest, the grassroots organizing, and I'll end with this, is the most important outcome of Assad's fall. Most people, whether bourgeois analysts or those on the left, especially the Stalinist or reformist left, tend to judge things by what happens from above. You know, what are the policies that are implemented? What's the government that forms? And I see some pro-Iran people are celebrating with glee the recent the military conference and so on, the declaring of Bashar as president. See, we told you, this was all Islamist plot from the beginning. Look at this, it's terrible. I think we have to say, even if, really bad things happen from above that we should absolutely be against, we're not indifferent to such processes. The reality is that the most important developments is what's happening on the ground in the networks, organizing, and political parties that are going to form over the next little while. And the future of Syria And hopefully the positive impact of Syria on the Middle East will be determined not by exactly the constitution that Ahmed al-Sharaa writes, but by the organizing and radicalization that happens on the ground among workers, students, and the poor. And it is to those comrades who we have to wish all the best in the coming months.
Thank you. That was super helpful. Banah?
Yes, can you hear me okay? Great. So I'm so happy to be here, so happy to share space with our other speakers, and just want to resonate and echo everything they said. Again, like what Sara said, today is the anniversary of the Hama massacre, which was from February 2nd to February 28th, 1982. And Hama, for the first time, was able to celebrate, and the protesters and inhabitants of Hama were out in the streets today for the first time ever, actually acknowledging this massacre. And that's my entry point, because that's my family's story, in a way, that they were part of those refugees of the 1980s and the late 1970s who were involved in political activism and had to flee. And I say that to say that the revolution has existed prior to 2011, even though 2011 was an incredible moment because of the Arab Spring. But as long as there was tyranny and dictatorship in Syria, there was always resistance. And so many people are, in diaspora, are born from different tiers of those moments. So I want to talk about the feminist conference that I was a part of in Syria, and just got back from. So I'm part of the Syrian women's political movement, الحركة السياسية النسوية السورية, which actually in Arabic is the Syrian feminist political movement. In English, it translates to women, but specifically names that it's a feminist movement. And it's not an NGO, it's not a civil society organization, it's a feminist political body that is uniting for a political change, and born from the Syrian revolution specifically. So half of the members are on the ground and have been working under fake names for years. And then half of the members are in diaspora, but many of them were political prisoners, were members of the Communist Party, were members of Kurdish freedom parties, and members of socialist and political prisoner movements. So we held the first kind of like feminist conference that is born of the revolution, in some, I don't know, 50 years. And we know that feminism can be used as a tool of imperialism, as a tool of the state. In Syria, the regime tried to claim that it was feminist, and as the protests were gaining ground, they would use kind of like a purple washing, like using feminist kind of critiques to say that these were like these Islamist, backwards young people that don't know what's good for them. So this is reclaiming feminism from that. So at our conference, we declared our solidarity with Palestine, always. We heard from Sana Mustafa, whose father, Ali Mustafa, is a well-known political prisoner, and she spoke to the very real concerns of the families of prisoners who have had very little accountability or engagement from the current transitional groups. Although the current transitional, I don't even want to say government, but bodies have met with Austin Tice's mother, who's like a white political prisoner in Syria. And it's like they have not even yet met with the Syrian political prisoners. So she was pointing that out. And I think that critique is really important. We had women's delegations from Idlib, from Sweda, from Salamiyya, Qamishlo, Ghouta, Jaramana, and Raqqa. Our youngest member of our movement was 2 weeks old. We had tons of babies because these are mothers who drove from all across Syria, bringing their kids and their babies to be part of this feminist press conference. So we heard from the prisoners movement support for Palestine, and central to our conference was Kurdish rights, and having Kurdish women activists speak to the fact that their comrades, in their areas of Syria who are Kurdish are fearing for their lives, and also some of them, their graves are still freshly in the ground from the rise of sectarian violence from these counter-revolutionary forces who co-opted the revolution. So I just want to say that, oh, they finally met yesterday. Yes. So yeah, I'll put a pin in that. On a personal note, I really want to echo that being in Syria was electrifying and incredible and devastating at the same time. This is a people who have been deprived of oxygen for so long, suddenly breathing again. So there's an explosion of political debates everywhere you go. And that consciousness was obviously always there, but it was underground and it was so dangerous before, and it was met with murder and torture and displacement. My family on my dad's side are peasant workers whose land was seized by the regime, and also who were among the first communities with Kurdish people who had the Kurdish Nakba in 1973, in which the Assad regime removed 140,000 Kurdish people from their lands. I think the peasants and Kurdish communities really felt the brunt of these neoliberal policies that Joseph talked about. So my family, my dad packed his bag for a week thinking he was fleeing Syria for a week and was gone for 44 years. So I got to return for the first time in my life because I'm part of that lost generation who never really got to speak about the crimes and brutality our family witnessed, as the people currently, had to just be without any witness, or very little witness to the crimes that they endured and the bombing and the genocide. So you're entering a country that is reeling from a state of genocide, essentially, that has been ongoing since 1971. Forced disappearances, mass bombings, the fact that 15 million people out of a country of 20 million were displaced. So that's the context. You're walking in, there's extreme food scarcity. In my own family, people keep mentioning this, and it's important. 90% of people are in poverty, so there's no electricity. That means there's no hot water in the winter. That means folks are really sick, but that also means for women who menstruate, for elderly women and elderly people, for mothers, there's an extra layer of what life is like when you cannot access food and water regularly. And to see also that in the city, and my family in the city living very difficult conditions, and then to go to the country, to the rural areas, where my father's from, and somehow see even more poverty. I was extremely moved by how my community and family uses local relationships to survive and to survive genocide, and uses organizing and this concept of like mutual aid that we have in the West. That is how they live. That's how they've gotten this far. So like just people popping in and out of the apartment and saying like, I'm out of fuel. Will you trade me some blankets and give me some of your fuel? Like these small interactions, like there's no gas stations. People are using corn oil and putting that in their cars because of sanctions, and also a direct result of the regime's punishment on the people. And so people, like my cousin's car broke down, and 14 young boys swarmed around to just help her and walked a mile away to go get her, extra benzene. So that really touched me. I thought of the Mahmoud Darwish poem that, if we love life, we find a way to it. It was just so remarkable to see my family who'd endured things like chemical weapons attacks, and, who are very lucky that their house is still standing, but whose windows are shattered from these regular explosions, have such a deep interconnected network of organizing that we can only aspire to in the West. And I think they're showing us, like during our own crises of capitalism and climate crises, how to actually survive. So I naively also believe that 7 of my cousins who had been in prison for decades might still be alive. And I, like millions of Syrians, was like, wondering if they would be released after being tortured for so long. And then we were able to confirm that they were actually dead, but a lot of people don't have answers. And so I think what the Syrian revolution taught so many of us is that we actually do need an internal critique constantly, that we can critique imperialism, Zionism, all of these isms, and also critique our own failures and authoritarian violence, but also internal dynamics. And so I think I thought it was so interesting. The feminist press conference was very harshly criticized. on social media. I mean, across the board. And it was a brutal backlash. And it was like, what are these women doing? We have no electricity. Why are you talking about gender? That's not important. Why didn't we hear from more refugees? Not realizing that half the group are refugees. Why didn't we hear from XYZ group? Not knowing that that group was there. You know, why are they so ugly? Why is their hair so unkept? I mean, really brutal criticisms, not a single positive comment, not like, hey, you pooled all of your resources together across multiple countries, managed to coordinate bringing all these women together across groups in Syria. We also stayed in our own house together, which was incredible, but very chaotic. And we got to live in close quarters and get to know each other. So all of that was erased. And I thought that was actually a good sign. I thought it was a good sign that people were so upset. And I thought it was a good sign that people spoke up and that there is a healthy level of like anything is criticized. I wish that people would criticize, and this is only after recognizing the revolution and the genocide and the regime, the dictatorship, but I do wish that they had that level of criticism for the transitional counter-revolutionaries who are prioritizing meetings with American businessmen who have already, without transparency, appointed people in their government, including family members of mine. Like, I'm criticizing that, you know, it's in my own family, and I'm not okay with it because I saw these all night like boys club cafe meetings that the Heya would do where there's no, yeah, that this is a little shady. People are just getting appointed because they know each other. So we don't like that. I am recalling also a conference that happened in 2011 at the beginning of the revolution. That happened in Damascus and in Istanbul concurrently. And I remember in the Istanbul conference, because I was there for that one, there were all these debates, like fierce debates. The Kurdish groups felt like they were being overshadowed, which was very real, and staged a walkout. The young people felt like the elders were speaking over them, and it was young people who started the revolution. And so they created their own young body called the Syrian Youth Activist Network. And then the elders then felt like punished, and the elder, like political prisoners, former political prisoners, wanted more space. And I remember turning to a woman journalist and saying, you know, these are all valid critiques of these dynamics, but not one woman has spoken this entire time. And she looked at me and said, oh, we'll take care of gender after the revolution. So it is after the revolution now. And to answer all those critiques of why talk about gender now, um, a big, you know, yesterday women in Qamishlo marched and were protesting to condemn the transitional government's appointing of Abu Sharqa, who, you know, was responsible for the murder of a Kurdish activist, Havrin Khalif. And so I think that's really healthy. You know, as soon as the regime fell, Turkish-led mercenaries murdered in a femicide 3 feminists in the Council of Zenobia, which is a feminist organization in Manbij. Those 3 activists, Qamar al-Sood, Aisha Abdul Qadir, and one named Iman. And the Syrian women's political movement was also birthed from femicides that were happening in our community, including the murder of Hiba Haj Arif, a 32-year-old activist and mother who was part of our movement and part of the Syrian Women's Network. And the local councils in eastern rural Aleppo, and the femicides of Hala Barakat and her mother, Aruba Barakat, who are my dear friends. So I think that we should continue, because of the Syrian revolution, to critique power, abuses of power at every side. And I think it is the people at multiple intersections, like these, you know, very, very like working class rural women from places like Raqqa who were bringing their kids to the feminist conference. I mean, I thought that was so brilliant. And I think that those are the people we really should listen to. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Banah. And to all the speakers, I'm actually going to ask one open question to all the speakers. I think we might have lost Sara. So to Omar, Joseph, and Banah, And then we'll open it up to audience questions. And when we do that, so after this round of questions, the recording will stop. And if you're watching on Facebook or something, you have to join the Zoom to be part of the discussion. But before that, I just wanted, I feel like the theme of today is kind of that dual dynamic in terms of open space, but also the problematic transitional counter-revolution, as Banah put it. So Joseph mentioned that HTS is a continuation of what was before in some ways, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. And then I know Omar and Banah touched on it a little bit, but how are people beginning to push back against them in terms of demands about political prisoners, or in terms of maybe more about what's happening in Suwaida, etc. But touching on that kind of dual dynamic a little bit more. Do we want to start in maybe 5 or so minutes each, or longer if you'd like? But Joseph, do you want to start?
Thank you, Shireen, and please cut me if I'm too long. No, I think the key issue that was mentioned by all the speakers, and I mentioned it in various articles, the key issue for us is the ability for the working class and the popular class to organize, to self-organize from below. And this space has definitely increased. And until now, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham does not have the military, whether the human capacities to manage the whole of Syria, which is a chance, but it's a race now. It's a race with the ability of the people to self-organize against Hayat Tahrir al-Sham consolidation of power, because it's going quite fast on their side, on state institutions, and especially regarding military and security services. So there's a new army that has been established, mostly composed, and now with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham soldiers, and with the inclusion of the Syrian National Army, which mostly acts as a Turkish proxy. For example, Banah spoke about some of the crimes they committed. Many other crimes could be mentioned, like Afrin, when the demographic change against Kurdish majority inhabited areas, but also more recently, they were nearly kicked out of Manbij by the local citizens because they wanted another armed group that is not as corrupted as them. And definitely this is a key also Turkish asset. We have to understand that today Turkey is the most important political power, foreign power, sorry, in Syria. And the fact that the inclusion of Syrian National Army within the new army is also an asset for them to pressure Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And we've seen also, I would say, a more harsh discourse regarding the northeast of Syria, the autonomous administration of the northeast, also pushed by Turkey, definitely. And I wanted to go back on a few things also, and it's correlated, it's related. So HTS is consolidating its power, regionally, internationally, and locally through state institutions. But definitely regional, international recognition is important for them. One of the, why I was talking about a lot of continuation. Obviously, we cannot deny that we have a new political elite. What we witness in Syria is a form of rebellion that changed the head of power, the centers of powers. This is undeniable. And this is why I said that the debate regarding the fear of the return of the Ancien regime is not present in Syria. Because what we had in Syria is very different than Egypt. The centers of power have disappeared. In Egypt, even following the fall of Mubarak, the centers of power remained in power, the key military centers. This is not the case anymore in Syria. Bashar al-Assad have left, Maher al-Assad have left, and Asma al-Assad and the key core. This does not mean that some of the remnants cannot create instability, as we're seeing in certain areas. But this is important to analyze the situation. So HTS, the biggest fear now is its consolidation of power, and also that could create further instability in the country. And what we're seeing already, crimes of against, not on a systematic level, but it's not anymore individual crimes. In rural Homs, the past few days, dozens of people, civilians, have been killed by security services of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Young people are being kidnapped and killed just because of their Alawite background. And I think there needs, and there's people working on it. And I come to the self-organization from below. How to reach civil peace. In Homs, there are different networks of activists working towards civil peace, meeting Alawites and Sunnis. They did a conference a few weeks ago to try to organize how to guarantee civil peace. And these are very important organization accents. We spoke, Omar spoke of Jaramana. Jarama just suggested what I think is a great idea, the organization of an alternative national conference of dialogue. Because the government, there should be a national conference of dialogue that was already postponed, but we don't know who will be the personalities, how the personalities are chosen. We don't know the program. We don't know nothing. And the alternative national conference dialogue suggested by Jaramana, saying we organize it locally, but every cities and neighborhood should do the same, inviting local actors, groups to participate in this debate and decide their own what are the most important things to tackle. So it's to increase local participation from below. This is quite interesting, and hopefully it will be followed by other regions. Obviously, what we didn't talk about also is that it's not able also to organize, self-organize everywhere the way we want, like in Damascus, Jaramana, or Sueda. For example, in rural areas of the coastal areas, the security situation is very bad. Certain areas of the north as well. Obviously, the level of poverty we discussed, but also there's, and this is a bit where there's a lot of attempts to organize on democratic issues. There's various coalitions that are being now put in place between left and democratic groups to defend democratic rights. I think it's very good, but there's a decisive criteria to increase the criticism of socioeconomic issues and to tackle these issues. So, for example, trade unions and professional associations, there's not much interest for the moment, and I think more should be. Only in one case, the Lawyers Professional Association asked for free elections because basically the leadership of the Lawyers Association, a new leadership was designated from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham that basically brought them from Idlib, the same kind of leadership. So there should be also, a designation of pre-democratic elections in all trade unions, professional association, because HTS is basically doing just as before. If it's not keeping the same people that were present during the Assad era, they're designating new personalities. And this is very problematic in terms of, and I think if we want to coalesce or to gather democratic and socioeconomic issues, it will go through trade unions, professional association, social movement. Because otherwise, if we don't do this, we don't tackle socioeconomic issues, there's a risk, I believe, that democratic rights would be treated as elitist. Because if people are not able to eat, to cover their daily needs, they will not be necessarily complete. I say a large majority. It's not that they will not be interested. They will not be able politically to participate in this kind of debate. So there's key issues to tackle here. There's also, we haven't talked about it, but there've been workers' protests following the laying off of the government. The government has announced 300,000 employees to be kicked out, to be removed, basically. Out of, we don't have clear estimates. Some people say 900,000, some people say 1 million state employees. But the problem now, the laying off are being done without any methodology, completely arbitrary. So every week we hear in a ministry, we're kicking out hundreds of state employees. No reason given for some people that have been in these state ministries for years, if it's not for decades. Obviously, this is not to deny that they were, a clientelist way of bringing in people, employing people. But the problem is, it's doing completely on no rules. And I think this is why I think one of the things, and I'm writing on it, I think it's how to mobilize people on key immediate demands. I think a public audit is absolutely needed of state functioning, number of employees, that could stop and freeze current laying off. Understand what we have. And also it's a way to freeze, and this is where I say there's continuity on the neoliberal policies of the current regime. I mean, they were invited, the foreign minister was invited to Davos, the kind of mecca of, global capitalism, especially Western elites. And they made their plan very clear. Privatization of all key state assets. We're talking about airport, ports, state companies. If you ask for an audit, this can be free. Understand what we have already. It's not an offensive demand. But I think it's represent the situation we are now in Syria on the level of mobilization. And I think we can reach a high level of mobilization on these issues, because despite the fact that we have decades of authoritarian regime, people still believe that the issue of the state and social services is quite important. And I think this is something that we have to build on. And especially in a country with 90% of poverty. And especially, again, that we have neighbors that went through wars and afterwards went through destructive neoliberal policies. And so it's easy to bring these cases to Syria. I mean, Lebanon, Iraq are two key examples. So I think here we can build this. I will finish on one thing is, again, and it's the self-organization from below. We've never seen in Syria popular demonstrations organized by the people for Palestine. On the day of the ceasefire in Gaza, throughout Syria, there were demonstrations in favor of the Palestinians. And it shows, the key solidarity, just as we've seen demonstrations not promoted by the government, but people on the ground to protest the occupation of southern Syria by Israeli occupation army. And actually, quite on the opposite, the government, current transitional government has been quite clear that they don't want to be a threat to neighbors. Well, the message was quite clear which neighbors they were talking to. So I think here, this is why I'm saying we have to be clear. There's rupture in the political elite in power. But when it comes to the mode of production, capitalist production, the way to deal with regional and international states, no, we have more continuity. And on neoliberal policies, authoritarianism. And actually, Ahmed Sharif, the Julani, made it very clear to the Saudi king, we stopped the revolution. Our interest is not to export the revolution, is to now build the state, basically. So to consolidate its power. But again, as it was said before, and I finish here, now we are in a race. The ability to self-organize from below is present, but I think the key issue will be for the left to coordinate socio-economic demands with democratic demands that are absolutely necessity. It's a necessity, but throughout the world, also the ability to understand that they go together, a social totality, that will have to fight against sectarianism, against Arab chauvinism, against Turkish attack, democratic principles, coordinating them with socio-economic issues and increasing mobilization from below.
Omar, did you want to add on that question?
Or Banah, do you want to go first?
Sure. So we're talking about current kind of mobilization and resistance and building capacity among the current activists and youth and workers and young people. When I was there was a protest in Duma against HTS, where at the site of where the Duma 4 were kidnapped, who were Razan Zaytuna, Samira Khalil, Wa'il Hamada, Nazim Hamadi, who were suspected to be kidnapped by Jaish al-Islam. And I thought that was a really good sign that you can have a protest. There's so much political organizing on the ground, as Joseph mentioned, in so many different parts of Syria. While I was in Damascus, I have a good friend who's like a feminist lawyer in Homs, and she was meeting with youth at a place called the Harmony Center, and they were doing like feminist peacemaking initiatives and trainings, but there was so much kind of much more heightened sectarian tension than in Damascus, especially in the rural areas of Homs. An extreme kind of, I mean, there's no police. So, like, even while we were there, we got in a few car accidents because there's so many internally displaced refugees, like 100,000 new people just coming in, and there's no infrastructure for that. So, people are constantly getting in car accidents, and there's no like accountability. Like, you just hit the car and you keep going. But on the other hand, because there's no police, young people are wearing vests and just putting on jackets and directing traffic themselves. They're also, my cousins participated in street cleaning, volunteering campaigns. My cousins also volunteered with prisoner data collection. The prisons have just been left open to be kind of in this chaotic way, like as an open crime scene, as many of the prisoners' families are calling it. So young people are volunteering to organize the data and to organize the files for the families of the prisoners. So this can be used in some kind of justice and accountability process. So people know it's not just that, oh, my cousins who are in prison are dead. It's like, how did they die? What happened? Who killed them? Like, we need that information, and it's getting lost. So I think there's some labor happening there around that, and it is the people. It is not, and I think also the current that HTS just does not have capacity in places like Salamiyeh. Some of our members in Syrian women's political movement are talking about how there's Uzbekistani foreign mercenaries that don't speak the language and don't have connections to Syria to know the delicate balance of sectarian diversity, and who are perpetuating a lot of sectarian violence. And there's also like some dynamics, some internal dynamics happening where like Bedouin communities are there's like some, just some extreme forms of sectarian violence happening in different places around the country. And so local volunteers step up. And in Salamiyah, our members there talked about how the local elders, like the respected people in the town, are acting as mediators, and they are stepping in and creating new kinds of accountability processes. And in Homs, young people are doing that. And that is, again, like, I wouldn't expect HTS, I wouldn't want them to necessarily either to act as that power anyway. So it is heartening to see people building capacity from below and participating in rallies. I mentioned the rally in Qamishlo yesterday, but that kind of healthy, like, speaking out constantly. I just have to uplift like the story of Ra'ed Faris and Hamoud Jneed, who were, suspected to be murdered by HTS or by Nasra, who were kind of the heart of the Syrian revolution. And so they were members of Radio Fresh, and were, targeted by Nasra for playing music on the radio, and then would do satirical things like play animal sounds instead to get under Nasra's skin. But they also were detained and imprisoned and shot before by Nasra, and then eventually assassinated. And so I say that to say that a lot of the heart of the revolution, a lot of those activists were brutally murdered and killed early on or in prison. So you have a country who is just barely like survived so much, that are trying to rebuild a movement that has been brutally suppressed from all sides.
Shall I just go, Shireen? Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think we have to be a little bit patient, because the extent of social dislocation of the Syrian revolution is also like, I mean, the millions of people in exile, and a lot of the people in exile were some of the most active in 2011 and fled, and young people. So they fled. And so like I noticed that the generation of the 2011 generation was present, but it wasn't as strong as I thought it would be in some places. And I think part of that is exile. And a big question is how many people return, and I think they're sort of waiting to see what HTS does. And a good government could attract a lot of those people back, and they could be a real resource. A bad capitalist government, socially reactionary, won't be very appealing. So that's a question for Syria moving forward as well. In terms of the organizing, yeah, I think what people have said, like, is a lot happening. I think we have to be honest that it's still small scale and very local. There's not a lot of institutions which unify activism nationally, which again is not some critique, because they've just come from this horrific dictatorship. But it's just sort of a fact. And the fact that the major parties on the left, you know, the major one being the Communist Party, but others as well, were very much implicated in the old regime, means that the infrastructure of resistance is starting from a very low level. And so it will take time to rebuild, and we should be patient with that. Another couple of examples, like Joseph emphasized the economy stuff, which I think is absolutely correct. But we all know, I mean, most of us here, I think, are leftists from various parts. It's very hard for the left to organize workers when you're small, right? You can't just click your fingers and conjure a strike about wages or the public health care system or welfare system. It's easier to take on political issues like whatever, you know, LGBT rights or women's rights or racism. It can be easier to have a small action about that, or even like a war overseas, than about the fundamental economic things with a small group. And so the things that I saw primarily were actions about the people who've been disappeared in Assad's prisons. There were actions about the curriculum changes that the government flirted with and then walked back under the face of public criticism to try and Islamize the school curriculum. There's been protests about workers' rights, not workers' rights, I should say, the sacking of public sector workers. Interestingly, in Sweden, the way that was organized was through the Hedark networks, through the anti-government movement for freedom and change that had been going there for about 14 months. So you can see how organizing of some kind can overlap into organizing of other kinds. But the scale of the economic attacks that are coming in terms of the sackings of public service, it's so hard. It's quite overwhelming. The cuts to the subsidies that the government is talking about and in some cases doing, it requires such enormous organizing that it can be hard to approach for a relatively small and fragmented left finding its feet for the first time. The institutions that are being built, like some of the mutual aid stuff that Banah talked about, also like the Jaramana Social Forum. I think it's no accident that Jaramana, this stuff is coming from there. It's quite an alternative political culture there with history of organizing. Sweda and Dara also have some elements of this, and Idlib as well. So the places where the revolution survived the longest in various forms and are places where there's more experience with organizing and more institutional sort of, institutions is too strong, but some sort of networks that can be used to build the future of the Syrian left. But I think importantly, the left has to try and build an alternative political pole at a national level, because a lot of what's going on is still very much localized. The goal has to be a national alternative political tendency. What makes that difficult in Syria as opposed to Egypt, say, where left nationalist, left Nasserist figures were able to pose as a third way between the regime and the Islamists for some time, is that the left nationalist, the Stalinist left, was so implicated in Assad's government that you've only got very small revolutionary lefts who have emerged from the Assad era with their noses clean, and that's a challenge, because obviously the revolutionary left is going to be much smaller than the old reformist and left Nasserist sort of left Ba'athist left Arab nationalist figures. So there's many challenges, but there's also a lot of hope on the ground.
Excellent. So we're gonna